You are listening to the Sinister DreamCast Network.
So, what's the plan?
I'm gonna start shaking things up.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Don't say that. What? That? What? That?
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
Tell him about the Twinkie.
What about the Twinkie?
Well, gentlemen, you have my curiosity. Now you have my attention.
Hello, and welcome to the Insert Movie Reference Here podcast. I am one of your hosts, Nick Kazan.
And I am one of the other hosts, Joe Conniff.
Good, I'm glad you came to this realization, Joe.
I know, it took a long time, but here I am, a host.
Thank you, Joe. So, how you doing, Joe? How are things?
Oh, things are fine. California's walking around like with sort of glassy-eyed, and not just because marijuana's legal here now. It's, recreational marijuana is legal in California. Boy, do we need it.
Can't say the same thing. I would say Pittsburgh and Philadelphia feel that way, but not the rest of Pennsylvania. Because we're going to talk, we now have President-elect Trump, which I'm not going to lie, the first time I saw that, I almost fainted. Like, I literally almost fainted.
I spent most of this at a bar, so when it all happened, you just look up at the TV, and it's just Donald Trump is president and elected president. You just kind of just stare at it for a while, and this is it. This is a real thing.
It's a bizarre feeling.
I think it's what a lot of people don't also understand about a majority of us that didn't vote Trump, not just because we think he's a bad choice, but it's just also it's absurdly undermining our sort of, he took advantage of it, but it absurdly undermines our entire process of sort of electing a president, and it feels like in an age of social media and internet that this is, and reality TV and the dumbing down and the poor education, like this is kind of what was the worst to come of it, because we're not just talking about somebody that isn't qualified. It's also somebody that just as a regular human being when they speak doesn't have any qualities about them that would make you go, this guy could be president one day. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people that didn't vote for him at all are sort of feeling right now, is there's this surrealness. Like, if Romney ended up being president, or if we just even ended up with just another George W., you're like, well, you lost to another politician. Sure, yeah. His thoughts and things seem crazy. Like Romney was a Mormon. When he would talk, it was totally like the things he would say were just completely nuts. And you're like, this guy can't be president. But if he became president, you'd go, well, he's been a part of this. He's been a part of the process of being in politics, and he's been a part of government, and he's understands somewhat of foreign policy. He's been involved with people that know it, and Donald Trump is really, to an entire generation, he's a reality TV show star. Yeah. And there's foreshadowing in all of this, because many years ago, Arnold Schwarzenegger won the governorcy of the state that I live in, and looking back on it, it sounds crazy too, even when you talk about it. And at the time, it was crazy that this guy got basically elected governor based on his Hollywood status. I don't know. And you go even further back to Ronald Reagan. This isn't really the first time, but it kind of still is. This is on a different level of not understanding what we need in terms of a commander-in-chief. So that's pretty much it. And then the other side didn't exactly turn out didn't try out their best campaign. So
yeah, so this episode, in trying to deal with it, we're going to explore movies, I guess, for lack of a better terminology, movies and politics, because they're kind of, they coincide a lot. Hollywood, much like horror in and of itself, appropriate now that I say it out loud, reflect the social, the culture of the country at the time. And then not just even in America and other countries as well, but, like, one of the things that we're going to tackle, and, like, by no means are Joe and I experts, but we have opinions. And that's what podcasting's about, everybody. Is the Red Scare, which was very much a thing. It was a scare, and it ruined a lot of people's lives. Not only just in Hollywood, but all around the entire country, where it was one of those things that, like, we put a standard on what an American is and what it means to be an American, and it was reflected heavily in movies, and just with screenwriters, mostly screenwriters, to be honest with you, a couple directors and whatnot too. But it's, I guess what I'm trying to get at is this is not our first time at this rodeo.
No.
It's the first time our generation's been to this rodeo, for sure. I feel like our entire generation, the millennials, are just kind of dumbfounded by this. But one of the things that I do a lot of times whenever fucked up shit happens is I like to look to history. Just because, just like Hollywood, this has all happened again.
Mm-hmm.
This has all happened once, and that old adage that you don't learn from history, you fail to repeat it, is very, very true. We've done it several times, and just within the last 150 years, for Christ's sakes. What were you gonna say, Joe?
No, I'm go on. I'm just listening. It's a process of information for me of everything right now.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess we could probably. Do you want to start with Mussolini, Joe?
I mean, we could start at that point. I mean, I think I'm trying to think of what we're trying to trend towards as well. If I know we're going to try to get to the blacklisting and McCarthyism and I mean, we can start there, I guess.
I mean, we could even start with, like, propaganda.
Yeah,
that's also...
I mean, that's kind of... I think the use of propaganda and film propaganda is really the beginning of understanding that as just a society and as a species that we can use film as a tool of persuasiveness, and that it can be direct as a propaganda film to just the sole purpose is to convert mentality and to sort of morph mentality, but also you can put those messages in subliminally in something that is not quite a propaganda movie, so to speak, or at least it doesn't feel like it when you're watching it.
Yeah. I mean, the first best example of propaganda, I guess, would probably be Birth of a Nation. But W.D. Griffin wasn't a racist, Joe.
No, absolutely not.
Do you know how many times I got into, like... There was one gal I went to college with, and every single time Birth of a Nation got brought up, because it obviously has to be brought up, it's a monumental feat. It is arguably, it's probably top 10 most important movies ever in world cinema.
Yeah.
And it just, I mean, it's the birth of the epic. You can trace a direct line back from, like, Lord of the Rings to Birth of the Nation, unfortunately. It just so happens that it's about the Ku Klux Klan and has white men in blackface and... But it was the first time that the American public got a taste of how influential filmmaking can be on the culture. Woodrow Wilson, I believe it was. Yeah, it was Woodrow Wilson. Had Birth of the Nation screened at the White House, and his reaction after watching it said it's like writing history with lightning. Which I also find interesting because I've read articles that claim that Woodrow Wilson was a racist because he screened Birth of the Nation at the White House. Just that. Mm-hmm. Just that alone.
Yeah.
No other reason. Just because he watched a movie that was popular at the time. But have you seen The Birth of the Nation, Joe?
No.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I know it did not do as well as they thought it was going to. Didn't have as much impact as it did. I don't think it helps that the writer-director had accusations of rape, which kind of ruined the momentum that they were going for. But have you watched Birth of the Nation? Did they make you watch it in film school?
I never watched it, no.
It was on Netflix for a while. I had it on my list because it was like one of those movies that, like, as a filmmaker, and specifically even being an American filmmaker, I felt like it was something I had to watch. But I couldn't bring myself to watch 3.5 hours of Ku Klux Klan propaganda. So it got taken off of Netflix before I got to it. But it was not meant to be, but it ended up being a recruitment tool for the Ku Klux Klan, actually.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I believe it was the 1920s. 1920s all the way through World War II, really. The Ku Klux Klan had over 1 million members in it, which is fucked up. Absolutely fucked up when you think about it. Because I think that they're dwindled down to 10,000 at the moment.
Yeah.
10,000 confirmed members. But yeah, over 1 million. Over 1 million. And Birth of the Nations, there's a direct line between Birth of the Nation and the Ku Klux Klan, like, getting the members. There was just, yeah. It's dumbfounding. It's just, it's so dumbfounding, especially with the climate that we're in right now. This is very fresh for us. For posterity purposes, Joe and I are recording this on November 9th. So, like, this is real fresh. I mean, I don't know if you can tell from Joe's tone, but there's some dour tone going on right now.
Yeah, there's also just a lack of trying to keep my thoughts on one thing. So I'm trying to, like, stay on top of this particular topic. Because this topic that we're talking about runs a lot of parallels, and it runs pretty deep in terms of really understanding film as a usage and as a art reflection. And in what kind of we're talking about here is that society falls in the middle of film when you are using film to manipulate society, and then that society produces film works of art as a result of what's happening to society. So it's this really sort of sandwiching in of like social mindset, and using film as a medium that kind of surrounds it. And that's kind of what I think we're trying to get at here about film. And typically, if you look at an era and you look at the films made in it, you can connect the dots. It's almost like you could pick up a history book along next to a filmography, and you can kind of just figure it out. It makes sense why certain stuff was made. Even bad movies. I mean, even bad movies that you're just like, that's a terrible movie. It's like, yeah, but it was made out of a reflection of something.
Yeah, it also, I guess also another point that I want to make is, like, how influential film and how important it has become to our society. Mm-hmm. I mean, 1920s, film was barely 30 years old at that point. And it was already being used to manipulate society in a way that we've never seen in the entire history of humanity. In the 6,000 plus years of civilization, we never had a tool that was that potent and that accessible. And we see that being used a lot with fascism, to be honest. Fascism and film kind of go hand in hand. So much so that Benito Mussolini opened the first film school. NYU, Tisch College, has its origins in fascism. And it's something that's even reflected today in Italian culture. Because in Italian cultures, movies are not allowed to have English titles. Hollywood films are all translated into Italian, like the titles. Even so much so that all of them are dubbed. Because Mussolini had this very, for lack of a better term, fascist law that there were no foreign languages allowed to be spoken in films at the time. So for a while, they were taking American movies, completely taking out the soundtrack. Completely taking out the soundtrack and putting Italian subtitles underneath it. And it didn't really work because they found out that I think it was something like 15 to 20% of the Italian population at the time were illiterate.
Yeah, they couldn't read.
Yeah. So, Mussolini was one of the first people to do dubbing. Something that's very common today. It started with Mussolini, and so much so that, like, in Italy, they don't... all movies are dubbed. Godfather 2, Robert Downey Jr. Robert De Niro speaks Italian the entire time. They still dubbed over his voice with an Italian actor. So, like, that's kind of what we're getting at, is, like, the influence and the power of filmmaking. And it also it went with the Nazis as well. I mean, Hitler had an entire propaganda department started by like, if you've seen Inglourious Bastards, though it's an incredibly and historically inaccurate movie.
Right.
It's very true that Goebbels was the head of the Nazi film industry. So much so that you had directors like Fritz Lang who ended up in America because they didn't want to make Nazi propaganda.
And that's all they were making over there, too.
Yes. They were making narrative propaganda, but they were also making documentary propaganda, which, have you ever seen Triumph of the Will, Joe?
I don't think so.
We watched a little bit of it in my film classes, and it used to be on Netflix, and I watched a little bit of it as well. It's another one of those movies that goes down for, like, technical aspects.
Mm-hmm.
I watched about 15-20 minutes of it. It's like a 3-hour movie. It's a 3-hour movie with really no dialogue. It's just showing, like, Nazi troops, like, marching in formation and showing the power of the Nazis. So it's a little hard to get through, but it's a very, very well shot movie, which is kind of disturbing. It's always disturbing whenever you see things like that, like, being used for the wrong purposes.
Yeah. So I guess we can move into, because I don't think that there's anything, at least in, because when you start, and what we've been talking a lot about, like, propaganda and using film legitimately as a tool. So when people are watching them, they're aware that there's a message in this of, government influence, I guess,
Yeah.
And realizing that you can make something like that and have an influence over the viewer, I think, Hollywood in particular realized that they can have an impact on the viewer watching things for sheer entertainment as well.
Yes.
And you can still deliver this stuff. You can still sort of create message in your film in an artistic manner that still morphs the mentality of the viewer. Which is, again, a very, very powerful thing to have. Because now you are what we became aware of, I guess, as Hollywood became more and more of a business, is we can take an unwilling spectator that is not going in expecting to get this information and put it on them and change their mentality on something when they expected to go see just a fun, enjoyable movie and just have a night out. And you're so vulnerable. The brain is so vulnerable in that situation because you're not expecting it. You have none of your defenses up. You're just taking in, you're letting your emotions get fed. and you get lost in movies, and when your emotions are getting fed something, it will consume it. Your brain will consume it, and that's pretty much what we ended up with in going into the 30s with McCarthyism becoming this like major thing, and then when we hit the 40s, it became the scare had become so big that they actually started the whole blacklisting,
Yeah.
And they actually started to become they had created this monster of subliminal propaganda, this monster and they created it themselves, right? They created this monster, and then that very monster became the fear. It became the tool that they feared that their enemy would use against them, which at the time was communism.
Yeah.
And then that was it. At that point, it was pretty much, there was this massive fear that communism was gonna come in and take over the film industry and brainwash everybody in America. So Hollywood essentially reacted, specifically, like Walt Disney and Ronald Reagan had a huge part in a lot of that. And so I would debate actually that because at the time that a lot of this the blacklisting started, is Ronald Reagan was president of SAG. And the way he handled the Hollywood 10, the way he handled the blacklisting, I think that had a lot to do with why he ended up being the president of the United States. I mean, that was pretty much his resume.
Yeah.
Which is insane. It's insane to think that this guy was running an actors union, and out of just pure fear started alienating people in the writing guild. Yeah. Out of fear of them being communists.
I mean, it was mostly writers. They really went after writers. Which writers were kind of... Because at the time, the writers were, for lack of a better term, the most liberal. Because a lot of the writers also came from theater. This is a time whenever you didn't have the arts weren't so separated. Because as we are right now, like, the arts... There are certain arts that are very separated. There's not a lot of crossover behind the scenes between theater and movies at this point in time. There's a lot of crossover with actors, but not so much with theater. So, like, you had a lot of writers that in the 1920s, during the Great Depression, the 30s, during the Great Depression, they were looking for alternate means of governance. And a lot of them just dabbled in communism. So much so that, like, they just went to a communist meeting to hear it out, find out what it is, and go, oh, this is unorganized and stupid. I'm not going to do that. But because the Communist Party was the way it was, and it kind of reported to Moscow, they made everyone sign in. So to make it look like, so they could report back to Moscow, like, oh, look how many people we've recruited. Meanwhile, most of those people didn't fucking show up a second time. I mean, the amount of writers that were blacklisted who were legit communists is minute. It was maybe, I would say probably less than 25% of them.
Mm-hmm.
A good bit of them had very liberal leanings. Like I said, a lot of the communists just kind of, that's where they were from. But, like, the vast majority of them were they just looked into it. I mean, there were several of them who just showed up because there was a girl they wanted to bang, and the girl was interested in communism. That's happened more than one time.
That's how things happen here in Hollywood, actually.
Yeah.
And what's really, really intriguing about a lot of this is people still talk about communism to this day like it's the great evil in the world.
That blows my mind.
Mind-boggling, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about 60-plus years, pretty much, ago, that this really was weighing heavy on our society. And really unfairly, too. I mean, I understood... But, like, I mean, it's the equivalent to being a Muslim now, probably.
Yeah.
People are... And that sounds like it's a crazy parallel thing to talk about, because one's a government and one's a religion. And it's like, oh, well, people are adopted into religions for all kinds of reasons. Well, people are adopted into governments for all kinds of different reasons, whether by choice, by birth, by their nation that they're born into, their traditions, all those things. And nowadays, if you're Muslim, there's a large group of people carrying the Muslim name in a very bad way. And there's a large group of people that are Muslim that are not that at all. And that was the same with communism. So a massive group of fucking communist countries, massive countries that were practicing communism and were completely peaceful.
Yeah.
But there's no convincing once you've created this fear-mongering in the United States. And when you've created this fear-mongering and then you start chasing it in a media-driven industry like Hollywood, you start to chase it, you start to become fearful of it too. You then stop trusting those within your own industry because of it, and then come out, and then here's just the sickening part of it. You basically end up creating all this propaganda against that thing, and you end up creating a propaganda that communism is evil, right? And then what do? Then they prey off of that fear by making movies that reflect that fear so that their audience come and watch movies based on those fears. Mm-hmm. And they come out in the end, and it's like, this is a great idea. Yeah. From Hollywood's perspective, it was a great idea. As an industry, it only thrived as a result.
Yeah. But, I mean, it thrived, but yet at the same time, it didn't, like, interpersonally. You had studios like Warner Brothers, who was super American. Warner Brothers was run by Jewish people. So they were super anti-Nazi, and then after the war, they became super pro-American. So much so that I believe the Warner Brothers is one of the studios that was one of the biggest for the blacklist. There were some studios that you may be able to get some work if you were blacklisted, if you used another name or something like that, but Warner Brothers it wasn't happening. Warner Brothers forced some of their actors to go in front of the House Un-Americans Committee to denounce, to just kind of get ahead of everything, to make sure that like they weren't perceived as un-American.
I think Bogart did that. I think Bogart was one of the big heavy hitters that they were really worried about being, because they couldn't lose his name. Him becoming discredited would have been pretty big.
I think Bogart was dead by that time.
In the 40s?
Oh no, I'm talking about the 50s.
Oh, okay.
Because we were too busy. We were too busy punching Hitler in the face in the 40s to be able to worry about this.
Well, the blacklist started in the 40s.
Oh no, okay, maybe it was. He died in 57. I'm wrong. Sorry. Oh, it started in the 40s, but it was the late 40s.
Yeah.
Again, it was all hands on deck in the 40s. It was pretty much wherever you can find help, it's welcome. I mean, also at the time, communists got a pass during the 40s because they were our allies, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So.
And if you want a film reference to a lot of what we're talking about and starting to get into talking about, Trumbo is the movie Trumbo that came out. Was it last year or the year before? I don't remember.
Last year. It was nominated last year.
Yeah. It. If you didn't know what that movie was about, it was about the Hollywood 10 blacklisted screenwriters that were in some ways all committed career suicide by uniting together, essentially. Which was, I mean, I think history will I hope history shines a good light on those people, because they're not really, they're victims of something that was completely outside of their hands. And Dalton Trumbo is basically famous as a result of that. And what was actually very interesting is the works that came from this, in terms of the way blacklisted writers sort of
created pseudonyms. Also got other non-blacklisted writers to turn in scripts under their names. There were several times. I shouldn't say several. There were 1 or 2 Oscars that were won by blacklisted writers who just had someone else turn it in for them. Actually, the Oscars were one of the big things that killed the blacklist, because that started happening so commonly that the Academy could not ignore the fact that there was so much talent involved with these blacklisted writers that they were just like, this is dumb. Like, this is un-American.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we keep these writers who were making these amazing scripts, and a lot of them had a lot of great social commentary in them and created a lot of progress. How can we keep and not award these writers and pretty much keep them from having some sort of some living in the industry? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've talked about this movie on the podcast before, but Woody Allen's movie The Front is a movie that he talks about. The plot of that movie is a blacklisted writer basically is sort of writing these scripts and is getting all these writers pretty famous as a result. So, I mean, there's a movie about that where, like, this guy has to kind of pretend to be this screenwriter that he's not. Because there's blacklisted writers basically writing all his stuff. So that's kind of it doesn't say that much about the Hollywood 10 as you'd like it to from a political aspect. It's Woody Allen. But, but still, it's a result of how this sort of thing has inspired work as a result of it. It's sort of inspired new ideas. And then, of course, you end up with a lot of the, Invasion of the Body Snatchers sort of movies where, that the Red Scare sort of tactic of filmmaking became this sort of just this easy money approach to things. Like the fear of being replaced, the fear of somebody's not being who they say they are, and all those things. Like, it was just so... at the time, no one even realized it was going on. And that's the other thing. Nick and I have talked about this on the podcast a lot, is it's really hard to see it when it's happening. It's really hard to notice these reflections a lot of time. Nick and I struggled for a long time to figure out why superheroes... And we've come to many conclusions as a result of as to why superhero movies are so popular, and going beyond even technology. Whatever it is, something will be popular as a result of what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
And that just at the time was probably one of the most effective schemes to making money in movies, plot-wise. And they could literally be expositional in their title.
Yeah.
As to what it was.
Yeah. I mean, you also, like, with Body Snatchers, it's also a good reflection on, kind of in the same way of propaganda, where it's actually a cornerstone of, like, sci-fi. One of the things about sci-fi is, the difference between sci-fi and fantasy is, they both use the fictional to inspire something. With fantasy, it is to inspire emotion. That's the reason why, Star Wars isn't so much... sci-fi, it's sci-fan. Whereas sci-fi uses a fictional setting to intellectually stimulate you. A good example is what they say in V for Vendetta, which is sci-fi is a lie to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And Body Snatchers is a great example of that. But yeah, the blacklist is such a dark time for our country, and just showing what fear-mongering can do.
Yeah, and what making an example out of somebody with fear can do as well to others.
Yes.
I mean, like we said, to this very day, there's people that just see communism as like the evil in the world, and you're just like. It doesn't exist. Like, there's not... Like, it's, like, not this thing that's gonna, like, rise up and take over fucking, democracy in this country. It's just not existent in that aspect. I don't understand. And even if it did, why people seem to think that it's rooted in some sort of morally, like, incorrect agenda is something I don't understand either.
Well, that's because communism is typically atheistic. That's,
right.
Like, the main reason why. And also, I don't understand why people were nowadays think communism's, like, the evil in the world, because, like, communism doesn't work. Like, we're talking about a governmental system that was more of a critical thinking exercise. Like, Karl Marx even said that it doesn't work. It was just more or less trying to think it through. Communism is one of those things that, like, sounds good on paper, but whenever you try to enact it in real life, it doesn't fucking work.
Yeah, and just thinking of alternatively is something that we should always just consider and encourage.
Yeah.
And if this is how things like that get treated, thinking differently, thinking outside the box. People always talk about thinking outside the box. You know what thinking outside the box usually does in this country? It alienates you.
Yeah.
We act like it's this thing that's like so special. Most people that think that they're thinking outside the box are still thinking within the box. Because when you start to think outside the box, people cock their heads at you and go, no, you're wrong. And then they don't like it. And then they get worried that everything that they thought was how the world worked is incorrect and would change if that were true. That's thinking outside the box. And that's why I think making original works of filmmaking is so complicated and difficult. People don't want to introduce information in films that is going to go against the mentality of the masses. You want an audience to watch your movies.
Yeah.
And if they don't agree with your message at all, they're not going to see your movie.
Oh yeah. And I mean, and like I said, we saw that in the Blacklist, in the Red Scare era. I mean, another person that we should probably, I mean, a lot of this was also, not only Reagan, was also perpetuated by someone else, Joe, that we should mention, and is incredibly hypocritical, because the exact same thing fucking happened to him not less than 10 years before the Red Scare, which was Howard Hughes.
Mm-hmm.
Howard Hughes was, even more so than Ronald Reagan, even more so than Walt Disney, Howard Hughes was one of the biggest proponents of the Blacklist. He was one of, and if you've seen The Aviator, he was put on trial in a House in a Senate committee also for war profiteering, and 5-6 years later, the motherfucker was doing the exact same thing to people in the industry.
Yeah, if you get unfairly accused of treason, and then you turn around and also, without all the information, unfairly accuse somebody else of treason, it's pretty twisted to not sympathize with what's going on here. But that's just a really strong example of how quickly this changes, and how quickly the mindset goes from that's not a bad thing, to that's the evil that we need to watch out for and be vigilant towards. You know, I mean, it can happen so fast. Yeah. It happened almost overnight, it feels like, on 9/11 with Muslims. So, I mean, it just happens that quickly. And then media just takes over from there. And we've been doing it for this long. We're pretty good at it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see how far back this goes. I mean, there's strong roots in being able to use film and the visual medium in general to sort of conduct whatever it is we want to conduct, whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. And when you see this stuff on the news and the media, yeah, it's frustrating, but you're watching that stuff to be informed. You kind of know that if you're an intelligent person, you understand that objectivity doesn't exist. It's literally impossible. There's no such thing as reporting the news from a completely objective perspective, unless you're legitimately just naming things that happened. But that's just not how the world is now. Now we have to write stories and columns and talk for 24 hours a day about news. So opinions get filtered in and perspective gets filtered in. And film is a totally different thing because, like I said, as a viewer, you are really not expecting to go in to be given information that you didn't ask for. Points of view that you didn't ask for. You want to maybe see a moral lesson just play out. You want to see a love story. You want to see something emotional. And like you said, Nick, with sci-fi, it was brilliant. It was so brilliant because it let people in a little bit emotionally, but it mostly attacked the brain.
Yeah.
With science fiction. It made your brain start going. And if your brain starts ticking, I mean, it can do a lot of things, especially when you're watching a movie, to change your perspective on something.
It's also something we've kind of lost as well. Max Brooks has talked about that, that he feels like the entertainment industry, and that's not, and I'm not just talking about movies, he wasn't just talking about movies, he was talking about all
reality,
media,
TV, and all this stuff, yeah.
Well, no, books and everything.
Oh, okay.
That after 9/11, that the entertainment industry did a ginormous disservice to the American people by not addressing 9/11 in any way whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
He gave the example of Friends. At the time of 9/11, Friends was the #1 show on TV. It took place in New York. They did not address 9/11 at all.
It was extremely taboo. 9/11
Yes.
became this extremely taboo thing that you just couldn't talk about.
And he even cited, another thing that he cited during Pearl Harbor in World War II. If you look at the media, you can point and go, oh, this is what was happening in the culture. I mean, there's a movie called Hollywood Canteen, which is about the Hollywood Canteen, which Hollywood put up for servicemen to try to help recruit servicemen as well as thank them for their service. You don't have that in 9/11. The example that he cited was one of the #1 songs in 2001 was "No Shirt, No Shoe, No Shirt, No Shoes, No Problem," and I'm feeling fine. Like those were the #1 songs after 9/11. And if you look at it, there is a huge disservice. It's gotten to the point the same people that helped get Trump elected are the same people who don't want any kind of message in their media whatsoever. But also the ones that complain about the dumbing down of America.
Right. So it's well, I mean, that's sort of what we have created here as this double-edged sword mentality of, everything's against you, but you still have control over the things. And that's just sort of where media is at right now, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's everyone likes to talk about how the media is making us dumber and not doing anything, but nobody's actually blaming the media for being complacent either.
Uh-huh.
And that's sort of a strange thing about it, is there's just this sort of, I guess what I'm trying to articulate here is there's just this sort of backseat driver aspect to American media consumers, where they go, they're just making us dumber. But then that's it. They just point to it and go, look, it's making us dumber. But then they just continue to watch this stuff, and there's no actual call to action to have stuff that sort of elicits a response and is actually going to make our brains start ticking. There's no desire for it.
How much money are the Kardashians worth?
Yeah, I don't know. A lot.
Well, yeah, but that's exactly my point. It's like,
it's pretty much it.
I mean, to the point now we have a president-elect who is most well known for being a reality TV host.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, especially when you look at how we can jump multiple eras at this point, because you don't have to. I think the reason we talk mostly about the Red Scare era and the McCarthyism era of movies is that that's kind of where it started. Yeah. In Hollywood specifically. And it's kind of where there was this aha moment in Hollywood that they could control things and that they could have a say, I guess. They could sway the public. They could have influence in such a way that was on a level that was never imagined before.
Yeah.
It's like, look what we've basically done here, you know, and look what we can perpetuate, which is even more important. It's not even just starting something; it's perpetuating it. That's the key. Is just keeping everyone firmly seated and distracted into whatever it is you need to distract them into, and that's what Hollywood realized. And great works have come from this very mentality. You know, great work. It's not all bad. That's the thing. But it's still all reflective. And sometimes that reflection is intentional. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's literally the maker not being influenced by these things and not realizing that they're perpetuating this same information.
No better example than On the Waterfront.
Yeah. I mean, you could use... Yeah, go on.
Yeah, because Eli Kazan is famous for turning people in and ruining the careers of a lot of people because he was from an Eastern Bloc country. He was an immigrant, so he was zeroed in on that, and he was a communist. Not at the time of the Red Scare. He denounced communism, but during the 20s and the 30s, he was a communist. He was a card-carrying communist, and it's almost seen on the Waterfront that Marlon Brando's character is Eli Kazan. It's his reflection of how he felt about the communists, that he felt like he was being thrown under the bus by the communists. And he didn't even write the fucking movie. But like that's a great example of what you were talking about, Joe.
Yeah, I mean and you even just see it in just general, like, why do we still have this problem with women in movies? You know, why do we still have these same problems where women are treated this way in movies and they're looked at as a second peg in movies? Even whenever they are the lead of a movie, they are treated that way by the men around them. It's because it's perpetuated. The people that write these movies don't realize that they're perpetuating these exact same problems over and over again because they grew up watching stuff that was like that, so there was nothing wrong with it. Even the women that grew up watching that stuff are watching these movies that are extremely, extremely sexist, and they don't see anything wrong with it. Mm-hmm. That's why Donald Trump can say the heinous things he has said about women, and women will still vote for him.
Because he tells it like it is.
Because, that is how it is, but that doesn't mean that we need somebody in there that's stating the obvious, or actually worse so, perpetuating the sexism that's in this country. Mm-hmm. The problem is a lot of women have had a man in their life treat them this way and don't know that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens in movies, is we're just not aware of what's wrong. It's part of becoming more refined, I think, is realizing that it's wrong and then changing it once we realize it's wrong, then we all have to change it everywhere. That's a massive overhaul of mentality.
Yeah.
And that's why we hold Hollywood's feet to the fire for this sort of stuff. This is exactly why people freak out at Hollywood for not making a difference, and why whitewashing is such a problem. Like this, they have the power to do it. They have the influence. They always have, and they know that they have it. It's just a matter of, are they aware that what they're perpetuating, and what is that even on their agenda?
Probably not.
Most likely not, because it's got to make you money, right? And until someone proves to make the money.
Yeah. That's the problem with the communist having a capitalist film industry.
Until the Hunger Games, nobody wanted to make an action movie with a female lead that actually did all of the things that a male lead would do. Yeah. Because those movies weren't going to make a ton of money because that movie just didn't exist.
Yeah.
And once that pops up and they have a franchise, they go, oh, well, let's do that now. So you end up with, Star Wars and all these things that are able to exercise it now.
I mean, you can see it even in the Hunger Games, because the first Hunger Games movie, not great.
Nope.
It was treated very poorly. It was treated like any other YA adaptation. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until it started to get popular and then Catching Fire through Mockingjay Part 1 and 2 was treated more seriously.
Yeah, so, I mean, now it's like, what are we going to... and that's the big question that we have, I think, right now, like, present day, is, are filmmakers going to react to this change appropriately? Mm-hmm. Is the reflection of what they make on how we're experiencing this, is it going to be appropriate? Or are they going to look the other way like we did in 2001? Are we going to end up with, one Oliver Stone movie that was poorly made and rushed for the sake of,
and didactic.
And didactic, yeah. I mean, is that all we're going to have? And we don't need Donald Trump the movie, how he became president. That's not what we're asking for. And I think that's the thing that's hard for people to wrap their head around. Simply just asking for there to be this understanding of what the American public is going through right now. Why did we do this to ourselves is the big question. Mm-hmm. And then, can we properly enact our art pieces? Can we erect art pieces that are going to, in film, in literature, like, are we going to create things that are going to properly communicate this to the future? Because that's all we can do is look back on this stuff. When we look back on it, it's clear as day. Yeah. It's always clear as day when you look back on it. And all of the propaganda movies that we're talking about, and all of the Red Scare movies, and the the Invasion of the Body Snatcher type movies, that stuff's clear as day now. But when it's happening, people are not aware of it happening. Mm-hmm. So
I do think we're going to see something. I think this was so monumental to so many people. Just seeing the reaction from the creative community at large, I think we're going to see something. But it's not going to be for a little bit.
Yeah. No, and it never is. I mean, like we said, look how long it took the superhero movies to pick up. And I think superhero movies are a direct result of 9/11, essentially. You know?
Oh, no, it's a coping mechanism.
Yes, absolutely.
It's 120% a coping mechanism.
Is it bad? Hard to say. But I would like the coping mechanism to not be a distraction, so to speak. I would like it to elicit some sort of like thinking involved, because I'm not that these superhero movies are stupid, so to speak, or bad, but they don't exactly make our brain tick. I
think there's aspects. I mean, you see Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Ronan, I think it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a zealot, xenophobic asshole. I think that's pretty. It's gonna be a while, just because there's a lot of things in production right now. Don't expect to see anything till late 2017. So, I'm only saying that just because I don't want people to be up in arms saying that there is no reaction via, not at post 9/11, mm-hmm. when there needs to be time. If anything, we should be looking at TV, because TV is a lot quicker.
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitably going to happen, because what we were saying in this podcast is essentially it always happens. No matter what, it happens. It's not something that we're always that conscious of happening. It's just, what will it be? I mean, it's kind of exciting in some regard, because you hit this monumental point in history, and you just wonder, how's the world going to react, and then how is art going to react?
Yeah.
You could end up with the best stuff we've ever made in movie history.
I mean, Eugene Merman did say, well, at least there's going to be a lot of good movies and music for the next 4 years.
And it's true. Especially with the news that we got, just recently about System of a Down making a new album, and it's stuff like that. You go, what's Zach De La Rocha doing? What else? Who else can we pull out of the out of the woodwork here and get them back, doing stuff again.
Rise Against is probably gonna have a great album too.
Yeah, and then even more exciting about that is who's gonna rise up out of all of this. Who's gonna be the artistic prophet that basically comes out of this that didn't exist before this happened.
Yeah, and honestly, that alone is the beauty of democracy.
Civilization in general, I think, but democracy allows it to happen. I think, at a much more streamlined. In a much more streamlined way. I mean, democracy and just, freedom in general. I
would also like to take this opportunity. If you got some spare change, probably a good idea to contribute to the ACLU. Just real quick, just letting everyone know they're going to need it. Something tells me they're going to be busy for the next 4 years. So... And that's a direct result of what we're talking about right now. ACLU is a really great defender of the arts, especially protest art, and we're probably going to need it.
Yeah, it builds culture and character in every generation. So why? And these are things that in a capitalist society, I think we have trouble wrapping our heads around: is culture and character and these things that aren't really tangible like money. And they're not quantifiable, but they are things that have a much higher value.
Stuff that we devalue until it's old.
Yeah, basically. And it's why nostalgia, I think, is so prevalent nowadays as well. But the nostalgia kick is another thing that is, I think, a very obvious, one of the more obvious things to come out of the post 9/11 era of, as a result of it, is the huge nostalgia kick from our generation, because everything changed so much and we had so much media when we were younger that we want to reach back to it because all this shit wasn't happening.
Yeah.
And I think that will be one of those things that will continue on. Because like I said, it's sometimes the makers are not aware of what they're doing. They get in the habit of reaching back because it works, so they're just going to keep doing it until there's nothing left. Until we're right back making, Oliver Stone movies, remaking them.
Great journalist. So much more a film journalist than a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, there's value in him, but I don't think it's in narrative. And
no,
I don't know.
He should be a documentarian.
Yeah.
He really needs to quit doing the narratives.
Yeah.
Because no one wants to watch it. They're like medicine. I think he can make a much more interesting documentary.
Well, he could be the humanitarian version of Richard Attenborough, so I don't know why he just doesn't do that.
Because he's a stubborn asshole.
He really is, yeah. I think he has value, but we'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting, but we'll see.
No, he does have value, but he goes about it the wrong way. Like at Comic-Con, yelling at everyone for playing Pokemon Go because of the GPS is not the way to get people on your side.
Yeah, it's a poor approach. Being aggro about anything at people never really gets them to see your perspective very quickly. It's the long road to it.
Yeah. So, Joe, I think it's time for the vault.
The vault! Oh. I have a movie, if you want me to go.
Yeah, you go, Joe.
Primary Colors. No, I'm kidding. Don't watch that movie. It's fucking terrible. Although it would be a funny movie to go back and revisit these days. I'm actually going to do a movie that I thought of while we were talking about this and fear and things like that. And the reason this movie popped in my brain, and I'm doing 1982's Tron. Because, we reach back the nostalgia, it's a victim of nostalgia as well, and creating a new one. But one of the other reasons I wanted to bring it up is one of the very interesting things about this movie is that it was revolutionary for the time in terms of visual effects. And you'd think any movie that was revolutionary for visual effects would at least get a nomination, for an Oscar nomination for its abilities. And one of the very interesting things about pieces of trivia about Tron, which a lot of people know, but it is still very interesting, is that it was not nominated for visual effects at the Academy Awards simply because at the time, and this is the early 80s, the Academy viewed using computers as cheating. and that was pretty much just the view, as it was cheating. And I don't know right now what we were talking about in terms of shaping mentality and changing how things are done, and how the world changes. You know, this is prior to 1985, or 1984, I'm sorry. So when that, if this movie is literally made 3 years later, it gets probably an Academy Award for visual effects. But because it was made just a few years before, the Macintosh really, became a household computer and a household name, and all of these things started to change our mentality. When you could sit in front of a computer and you saw it face to face and knew what it was, then it was okay. And nowadays, all visual effects are done with computers for the most part. In fact, it's unusual when we see practical effects. And it's just funny that just in 1982, a movie was basically denounced for using computers. And that's just at the time it was made an example of, hey, don't use computers to make your movie. You're not going to win any awards for it. A very short-lived message to use, an example to have been made, but it was still nonetheless an effort, because there was this fear-mongering of computers going on in the early 80s about filmmaking and computers, and it was, Tron is basically a result of it. So, yeah, check out Tron. It's also it's retro as all hell. It's fantastic.
Fuck.
Yeah, if you love the history of visual effects and you love production design in general, this movie is a gold mine of stuff to kind of check out. So there you go. And Steven Lisbergers, who only ever did Tron 2 after that. I don't think he ever did anything else.
Cool. I'm going with them because I've been recommending shitty movies for specific reasons. So now I'm going to recommend a awesome movie for a relevant reason, which is 1954's my favorite director, Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. I believe I've done this on the podcast before, but the reason why I'm recommending Rear Window right now is because Rear Window is based off of the Red Scare that we talked about in this episode, not trusting your neighbor, and what are they doing behind that door? In this case, it's not about communism; it's about murder, because it's Alfred Hitchcock. Of course, it's about murder, but it's a movie that is a direct reflection of what was going on at the time. That you don't trust your neighbor, watch your neighbor, report your neighbor if they're doing something wrong. And I mean, it turns out okay, and not okay for the murderer's wife, but it was it turns out okay for Jimmy Stewart. It's a fantastic movie. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, it still holds up. That's something that really needs to be said. Is that this movie really holds up. You can watch it right now, and you would barely... If it wasn't for the fact that the film stock looks like it's from 1954, you wouldn't really know it's from 1954. Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart tour de force in this movie, especially for the fact that Jimmy Stewart is sitting down for the entire fucking movie. He's completely immobile, so he has to do everything based off of his face acting. And Grace Kelly is just absolutely stunning, both in her performance and just looking at her. She's the kind of beauty that you just don't see anymore.
It also and Nick, you know that this has always fallen in my top 5. So it's one of my favorite of all times. But it also encouraged voyeurism, something that hadn't really been done before. So I don't know. It's just it was a different way of sort of socially pushing vigilance.
Yes.
Like what you talked about, watch your neighbors and keep an eye on everybody.
It's also the first installment of what film critics and film theorists call Hitchcock's voyeur trilogy, which it starts with Rear Window, then goes on to Vertigo, and finishes up with Psycho.
Yeah.
So, but it's a fantastic movie, and I'll probably recommend this movie again at some other point because it's that good of a fucking movie. There you go, 1954's Rear Window.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add there's a sci-fi movie coming out this weekend. I think maybe even the day after we release this, called Arrival. So I think if we want to just start early, because it's been a while since we've gotten a sci-fi movie like this. So I mean, and Arrival seems to be using some of the old Cold War sort of information that, you know, it's almost like it's an updated Cold War scare tactic movie. So I definitely want to check it out at some point, because I'm curious to very much look at these things and our social norms now and what it uses to kind of tell its story.
Yeah. Well, I think that wraps up another thrilling adventure of the Insert Movie Reference Here podcast. What do you say, Joe?
You would be correct.
Well, I guess that means I'm Nick Casino.
And that means I'm Joe Conniff.
See you next week. And see.
You have been listening to the Sinister Dreamcast Network. For more from Sinister Dream Productions, check out www.sinisterdream.com.